Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're looking at a corporate story that, honestly, it feels like it was written straight for Hollywood. I mean, we're unpacking the story of a company that didn't just sell devices. They literally defined how the entire world communicated for over a decade. And then, poof, almost overnight, they just vanished from the top. Today we're diving into the totally unbelievable rise and spectacular fall of Nokia.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of Nokia's dominance back in the early 2000s. At its absolute peak, Nokia controlled over 40% of the global mobile phone market, by themselves. To put that into perspective for you today, Apple's current global smartphone market share fluctuates around 20%. That means Nokia was twice as dominant as Apple is right now. And their devices? Absolute legends. They were affordable, they were elegant, and as many of us remember, they were virtually indestructible. You could literally drop a Nokia 3310 down a flight of concrete stairs and it would barely get a scratch. If you owned a mobile phone in 2004, it was almost certainly a Nokia. They were this unstoppable titan with seemingly unlimited resources.
But their origins were actually incredibly chaotic and honestly super unlikely. Nokia didn't start out in some shiny Silicon Valley garage. Nope, they started all the way back in 1865 in southwestern Finland as a humble paper mill, just grinding wood pulp into timber. Over the next century, their business model was totally all over the place. I'm talking merging with a rubber company to make boots and tires, manufacturing televisions, military respirators, even electricity cables. But then in the late 1980s, they made this massive, high-stakes, bet-the-company gamble. They sold off all those traditional businesses to focus entirely on unproven telecommunications. And wow, did it pay off. They helped build the GSM network standard, released the Nokia 1011 in 1992, which was the first mass-produced GSM phone, and by 1998, they had completely overtaken Motorola to become the biggest mobile phone brand on Earth.
So how exactly did they capture the market so completely? Well, Nokia basically turned the mobile phone from a cold, boring piece of corporate utility tech into a highly personal fashion statement. Suddenly, phones weren't just for rich executives in cars anymore. Nokia made them small, sleek, and affordable. They gave us those awesome changeable plastic faceplates so your phone could literally match your outfit. They introduced customizable ringtones, and of course, they gave us the incredibly addictive game Snake. Nokia wasn't just winning the market, they literally were the market. And what's really wild is that they had so much cash lying around. Their flush research and development department actually invented early versions of the smartphone, a touchscreen tablet, and even an online app store, years before anyone else in the industry. But ironically, this massive success planted the very seeds for their ultimate undoing.
Okay, let's dive into the fatal flaw here. Despite all that R&D money, Nokia had a ticking time bomb at the core of their products. It was called Symbian. Symbian was Nokia's underlying proprietary operating system. But here is the absolutely crucial detail. It was built in the late 1990s and designed very specifically for basic phones with physical numerical keypads. It was never ever meant to be a modern computing platform. As the years went on and Nokia's engineers desperately tried to cram modern features into it, like high-res cameras, music players, and early internet browsers, this aging software just became an unstable, messy labyrinth of code. It was incredibly difficult to update, completely clunky to use, and an absolute nightmare for developers to work with. So the really crucial point here is how this technical debt bred a seriously toxic corporate complacency. Inside Nokia's headquarters, top executives were making billions of dollars every single quarter just selling hardware. Because they were so phenomenally dominant, they developed this dangerous hardware-first mindset. They falsely believed that hardware alone drove sales. To them, the software, the operating system, it was just a background utility, kind of like the engine of a car. As long as it ran, the user didn't need to worry about it. What they were completely blinded to was the impending software-first reality. They simply couldn't see that software was about to become the soul of the machine and the entire driving experience for the user.
And then came the day that changed everything. January 9th, 2007, the Cupertino shockwave. Just picture the famous footage of Steve Jobs walking out on stage in his black turtleneck, pulling the original iPhone right out of his pocket. This was a monumental, earth-shattering event for the tech industry. On stage, Jobs explicitly called out the industry giants, showing a slide of the top phones of the era, including Nokia's flagship devices. He directly mocked their permanent plastic physical keyboards that couldn't change based on what the user actually wanted to do. The iPhone was a radical departure. It wasn't just a phone that could occasionally browse a terribly formatted web page. No, it was a pocket-sized computer driven entirely by a dynamic, multi-touch glass screen. Now, when Apple unveiled the iPhone, Nokia executives publicly laughed it off. They had this whole laundry list of dismissals ready to go. They pointed out that the iPhone lacked 3G connectivity, they laughed at its terrible battery life, they scoffed that a giant screen made of glass would instantly fail Nokia's rigorous drop tests. They confidently told the press that Apple was just some niche player making an expensive toy. But the reality? That toy was a radical interface departure that changed everything. And privately, inside Nokia, panic was absolutely setting in. They tried to respond by forcing their outdated Symbian software onto experimental touchscreen devices, but the results were just disastrous. They were laggy, full of bugs, and deeply, deeply frustrating for consumers to actually use.
And while Nokia was struggling with Symbian, a second and honestly arguably more dangerous threat emerged: Google Android. Android offered every other phone manufacturer in the world a modern, touch-first operating system entirely for free. The market shifted instantly. Rival hardware makers like Samsung, HTC, and LG realized, hey, we can't compete with Apple's software on our own, so they immediately jumped aboard the Android train. But Nokia stubbornly refused. They were too proud. They felt they were too big, too important to rely on another company's software. They insisted on pushing forward with Symbian. Because of this stubborn pride, within just 36 months of the iPhone's launch, Nokia's massive market share began rushing down a steep, terrifying cliff.
By 2011, the situation was beyond dire. Nokia's new CEO, Stephen Elope, issued what is now a legendary internal memo to his employees just to wake them up to reality. He wrote, and I quote, "A man standing on a burning oil platform has to choose between burning to death or jumping into the dark, icy waters." He was telling his company point blank that their Symbian platform was on fire and they had to jump to survive. And they did jump. They made a massive leap. But tragically, they jumped in the exact wrong direction.
Instead of adopting Android, which was already dominating the market, Nokia made an exclusive partnership with Microsoft to run the Windows Phone operating system. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why that was a fatal error. The modern smartphone war was no longer about hardware specs, it was a war of ecosystems. While iOS and Android had thriving app stores where developers were making millions, Windows Phone was basically a barren wasteland. Nokia found itself in a classic catch-22. App developers didn't want to waste their time building apps for Windows Phone because, well, nobody owned the devices. And consumers refused to buy a Windows Phone because it didn't have any of the apps they actually wanted. No apps meant no users, and no users meant no apps. It was a vicious cycle.
All of this leads us to a truly shocking financial reality: $7.2 billion. By 2013, completely starved of apps and bleeding cash rapidly, Nokia's mobile market share had plummeted to less than 5%. In a totally desperate move to salvage whatever was left of the company, Nokia sold its entire mobile phone division to Microsoft for just $7.2 billion. Let that sink in for a second. This was a tragic, almost unbelievable fraction of a division that, just a few years earlier, was valued at well over $100 billion. It's literally one of the greatest wealth destructions in corporate history, all because they refused to adapt to software. During the press conference announcing that heartbreaking sale to Microsoft, Nokia's then CEO ended his speech with this quote: "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." It is a profoundly sad quote, but as an analysis of what actually happened, it is entirely incorrect. They absolutely did something wrong. They mistook their past success for a future guarantee. They became so heavily focused on protecting their existing multi-billion-dollar hardware cash cow that they totally failed to see the software revolution staring them right in the face. They didn't fail because they couldn't build great phones, they failed because they couldn't adapt to a world where software was the only thing that mattered.
Which leaves us with this final, vital takeaway. In a rapidly evolving tech landscape, or really in any industry today, are you adapting or are you just standing still? Nokia's story is the ultimate cautionary tale that having the most money, the best engineers, and total market dominance absolutely cannot save you if you refuse to evolve. Resting on your laurels is a fatal cost. Standing still is quite simply the fastest way to die. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep adapting, and I'll catch you next time.